Jo.
Herzlich willkommen bei 99 zu 1. Eine ganz besondere, ist keine Zwischenmahlzeit, das ist ein Crossover. Heute haben wir nämlich unseren Lieblingspodcast aus den USA zu Besuch. This is Revolution Podcast. Wir holen die Jungs auch gleich rein. Kurze Vorwarnung für alle, wir sind natürlich dann heute auf Englisch unterwegs, das heißt, wir können nicht auch on the fly irgendwie Untertitel oder so anbieten. Wenn ihr trotzdem irgendwelche Fragen habt, könnt ihr die natürlich gerne in die Kommentare auch auf Deutsch reinschreiben und wenn irgendwas passt, dann nehmen wir das auf, übersetzen das und fragen die Jungs. Willst du noch irgendwas sagen, Daniel? Habe ich irgendwas vergessen?
Let's go.
Alright, ich bin tatsächlich nervös. Ich glaube, ich war schon lange nicht mehr so nervös vor einem Stream. Okay.
Ich habe auch ein bisschen Lampenfieber.
Fangen wir an. Let's start with the man, Jason Miles. Welcome. Jason Miles is singer, guitarist for Bitter Lake. He is the co-host and the founder of This is Revolution Podcast. Welcome to 99 zu 1. Please pronounce our podcast.
Say it again.
99 zu 1.
It's 99, so it's 99. Oh. I can't.
Don't worry about it.
You just say it to me like
putting you on the spot.
2 and learning how to count for the first time. I should be able to count 10 in German. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's it. I forgot what 10 is.
10.
Same.
Very good. Very good. Though. Close. Yeah, 90%. Good. How are you doing, Jason? All good?
Yeah. I woke up. I'm caffeinated. I'm ready to go.
All right. So let's bring the rest of the team in. Contributor to Black Agenda Report and co-host in This is Revolution, Pascal Robert. Welcome to 99 zu 1.
Guten Tag. Guten Tag.
Oh, guten Tag. And you actually dressed for the occasion, I see. You're wearing our brand
our colors,
violet.
Yes.
Is that the national colors of Germany? Is what, purple?
No, that's the podcast color.
Oh, it's a podcast colors. Oh,
we didn't want to go for anything like too on the nose, reddish, blackish, or a mixture of both. So we settled on purple as
I like the color.
It works.
It
it's
does.
very good.
I like you guys.
Right.
You guys have nice houses.
Yeah,
the house. Oh yeah, well,
it's actually flats. So houses are very expensive inside of Berlin, but
flat gang.
Let's bring in,
as they say in the area.
Yeah, let's bring in the rest of the crew. Now I forgot. Was it? Let's go.
No, it was first.
Gene first, I think.
Yeah,
Gene first. Gene Bajalan, welcome. Gene is assistant professor of history at Missouri State. I know Gene since over nearly 2 years from various podcasts, also from TMBS, Michael Brooks Show. That's how I got to know you, and that's ever since I'm a fan of yours. So I'm pretty stoked that you're here today.
Well, guten Morgen. It's a pleasure. Ich heiße Gene. Ich komme aus England und ich wohne in Springfield. Es ist ein Arschloch von Amerika.
Nice one.
Yeah,
that's very nice. That was
okay. Good.
Fucking great.
Good. We got that on record.
Totally showed up my Guten Tag, man. Totally.
Yeah, Pascal was putting so much effort into this, and then you just shit all over it and steal his thunder.
Jason had the first 9 numbers of German down pack. It was
I had
just
to learn a song, and we had German class in 6th grade. I had a very advanced public school at the time before the funding got cut, and they offered, I want to say, 11 different languages, Swahili, and I took German. I was like,
that's a good question in there. Why?
he was probably a big Boney T. What is it, Boney M? What was the black musician?
Yeah, Boney M. Yeah,
Boney M.
Rasputin, Russia's biggest love machine.
Yeah, isn't he from Germany?
They are. The guy who produced them is a well-known con artist who had a lot of artists on his roster, fucked all of them over. He was called Frank Farian. I think he even had a prison stint, but I'm not sure about that. I don't know.
I think you're right.
But Kuba's
Okay,
probably
let's not-
gonna come in with fluent German because he's the deep state.
Yeah.
They know all the languages.
That's what I was about to say. Like I was about to say, let's let Kuba in, but he's probably already in. So Kuba Rezhnevsky, defense analyst and economic development consultant. Welcome to 99 zu 1.
Herzliche Danke, meine Kameraden.
Kameraden is a little bit how can I say? Kameraden is the one that the other side says.
You want to say
Yes, the other side.
Exactly. And I gotta say, Jason and Kuba, they are competing for best radio host voice I've ever heard.
Yes, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
Mine has too much vocal fry. It's Jason for the win, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But Kuba really cultivates his voice with the cigarettes.
That's true.
He's putting in the effort. How many Marlboros are you tanking a day?
His voice is going to sound amazing by the time he's 48.
Yeah.
Damn.
Good cigarette.
When is that? Like
5 years in of smoking and brandy. Oh yeah, that
Mhm.
voice sound.
My parents and my insurance company follow me on the internet, so thanks a lot for divulging a lot of confidential information. This is why you're not deep state Jason, my friend.
I was actually aiming for a voice like that with a lot of beer, whiskey, and cigarettes, but I just can't anymore. A hangover these days is more than one day. This is just not fair. It doesn't like the cost effect ratio is just not given anymore.
Take y'all's word for it. Gene doesn't. You don't really drink that much, do you, Gene?
Not anymore. Used to drink a lot. Used to smoke.
I
a lot.
mean,
but
but
now
he's British, right? So take that with a grain of salt.
that's true. That's true. Like
I
not
once-
drinking a lot by British standards versus American standards is quite different.
Yeah, only like 2 or 3 stone worth of lager a day.
And it's like 6 pounds per bottle in a bar. It's insanity. It's like how do they even get drunk in the UK? I went to a punk festival of all like things, and it was 5 or 6 euros for half a liter of beer. And I saw like people were drinking so much. Nobody was throwing up. Like in Germany, there would have been puke everywhere. But no, not in England. The beer is too expensive. Once you have it in yourself, you're not going to let it go. This is like 100 pounds worth of intoxication in you.
And once again, the market delivers, right?
Well, the critical skill is for the smart consumer, you don't purchase from a pub. You go to an off-license and buy something that's high impact, such as White Lightning, which is a kind of it's a cider, which
Also an antifreeze.
An antifreeze and a cider. Yeah, it's very cost effective. For cold mornings, you warm yourself up and you clean your windscreen with it.
Nice. Guys, can you maybe each one of you start and give us a little bit, like just a little introduction to the guys that don't know you over here? Like, what's your personal story? What's your political journey? How and when, why did you get radicalized politically or interested in what you're doing today? Maybe just a couple of sentences so that people get to know you guys.
I'll start this since we're talking about the show.
Sure.
For me, growing up in the Bay Area, you're kind of immersed in a certain, especially where I'm from, in the East Bay, you're kind of immersed in a lot of radical politics, going to school with like ex-hippies kids and ex-activist kids. Definitely taught me a lot. So I always had a certain aspect of being politically conscious, especially the high school I went to, as the fellas can attest to. So many people that I went to school with are guests on the show. As far as like really hardcore radicalization and making it kind of a permanent part of the music and just my personal ethos would be traveling throughout the United States, actually. Between 2012 and 2016 was a very radicalizing moment. I really saw kind of firsthand the rise of people like Trump. and that is a big reason for this show, because I spent so much time in what we in the States call B markets. So smaller markets, probably where people would stereotypically think the fanatical racist Trump base is. There's some truth to that, but I spent way too much time in those areas playing shows and meeting people, because I'm not in a huge band where I'm going to be in a bus and have a back this stuff. So I've constantly been immersed in this world, and I felt that because I had a small bit of influence, that it was important that I dispel certain narratives that they have been kind of force-fed almost through American exceptionalism, the horrible propaganda in our public school system, and just kind of right-wing news. So that's kind of my story. You want to?
All right, cool. Pascal, why don't you tell us a little bit, like how, like first maybe your own story, and then how did you get to This Is Revolution? How did you get to know Miles?
I think that for me, most of my quote unquote radicalization would have to start from my own family background. One of the things that I've talked about on our show, particularly with Jason, is that, you know, my parents were immigrants from Haiti during the 60s, what in itself was a very kind of radical political time in terms of global history and even America overall. But, you know, my father's family were always kind of radical within the context of Haitian politics. He had two brothers, one older, one younger, who actually left Haiti to go study in the Soviet Union. So obviously that should incline you, show the degree to which they were inclined to radical left politics. So growing up in my household in New York, when my parents eventually did emigrate to New York City, I was born and raised in New York. It was very common in my household on the weekends when my father would have his friends over drinking, you know, playing dominoes or cards, that they would be talking about politics every weekend, you know, anti-imperialism, you know, economics, global affairs, so on and so forth. So that became a kind of normative discourse in my household growing up. And so I always kind of had a kind of worldview of politics from a non-conventional kind of anti-authoritarian kind of perspective overall. So growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in America, which had a kind of a very, very kind of, you know, the Cold War era, right-wing political force, I never really bought into the kind of narratives that were being propagated through normative educational indoctrination. I move on until the millennium with the rise of Obama, and I became affiliated with a publication called Black Agenda Report, which was started by two former Black Panthers from the 1960s. One of them, who was my good friend and mentor, Bruce Dixon, who passed away in 2019, and another one was Glenn Ford. And the rooting ideologically of the publication was kind of from a radical, revolutionary kind of like Marxist-Leninist leftist perspective. So spending several years, even starting with the Obama administration, writing for them, having done my own writing, even though I had worked as a lawyer before I started writing as well, help further move on in terms of my kind of political education, as well as my radicalization process. So for me, actually, my ultimate in terms of intellectual radicalization really starts with the Obama presidency and moves forward. My kind of area of specialty is Black politics, domestically and somewhat internationally. So I come to know Jason as a result of not only my writing with Black Agenda Report, but a mutual friend who is Torrey Reed, as you probably know, was Adolph Reed's son, who knew each one of us, and I had been thinking about trying to develop my own podcast for quite a while. People had told me that I should do my own podcast based on media appearances, and he basically told Jason about me, and we came together and we kind of realized that, you know, we both had something to contribute to each other's kind of development, and that really kind of from there on, a little bit more than 6 months ago, is how my participation in the project that Jason started called This Is Revolution podcast kind of takes off.
Nice.
What did you do?
I also got something. I got this. Well, I got my own soundboard, just so you know, Jason.
A little soundboard.
Jason has got an applause button too, but it's not nearly as polite and restrained. I think it's
Yeah,
the
I
American
turned on-
version has more.
No, I turned down the volume because yesterday I shocked. We were on another stream and I shocked someone with the loudness of it. So that's why it's a bit quieter now. Yeah, and then I mean, yeah, 6 months, man. It doesn't feel like 6 months. I'm also listening to you guys since like December.
That's
But
about
you know,
started.
as I-
So yeah,
That's that was
yeah.
the first podcast
Exactly.
that Jason and I did together was in December.
the first show I saw was that New Year's show, I think, with Ture Reed,
Yeah.
right? That was
That
the
was a
first
good
show
one.
I had.
Robinson or Johnson.
Yeah, and,
Johnson.
yeah, that was a great one. Yeah, and,
Yeah.
but yeah, it feels like much longer ago.
It feels like a decade.
Yeah, exactly.
I was starting doing this show by myself. It actually had a different name. A good friend and fellow musician and graphic designer, because originally the show, it was a music show. Apple Podcast classifies it as a music commentary show, and I can't change it inside of Apple for some reason. But anyway, he came to me when I was about 15 episodes in, 20 episodes in, and he said, you know, this is no longer a music show. You should change the name, because if I want to hear politics, I really wouldn't want to hear a show called Sound Waves. And I was like, are you sure? Like, this is where I live, Soundwave Studio. He's like, nah, man, just change it to one of the lyrics in your song. He goes, I have an idea. And he gave me the imagery that is the imagery now for the show that we're using for this. And he actually designs the merchandise and still help out.
Great, really great job. I really like your style. Then at some point, Gene and Kuba joined. I think first they came in for an interview, and now they're kind of part of the crew, right? So you
You can
guys
thank
are
Doug Wayne from Zero Books for that.
all right. Yeah.
For introducing me
Kuba,
to.
why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I was born in Poland when it was still the People's Republic, and my family came over as refugees to Canada when I was young. We left illegally. We were asylum seekers in Austria. We lived for a while in an asylum hostel. When the 2015 migration occurred, and you started seeing asylum hostel showing up in the media about the wave of migration from the Middle East, Syria, Africa, Afghanistan. It was remarkable because it's like, oh, I used to live in one of those. Both of my grandfathers were politically active. One of them was in the Communist Party, and the other one was hard nationalist. So I'm from a mixed family, and my entire sort of intellectual life was driven by trying to understand the difference between my homeland and where I grew up. Why was Polish history so unhappy, and Poland an underdeveloped and harsh place, while Canada was so pleasant, so successful in many ways? And it kind of pushed me to learn about political economy, learn about international relations, security issues, defense issues, military history. I studied, that took me to Harvard University for my undergrad, and I had always had sympathy for the left, but nothing radicalized me more than meeting the people at the top of capitalist globalization. Because poor people, normal people, there's no point being too romantic about it. They're people. Some are good, some are bad. They all deserve a decent life, but they're nothing special. But the people at the top do not trust them, right? Like any ideology that opposes that kind of domination, and any system that produces those kinds of elites, there's a serious problem with it. And that's when I took a very sort of strong left oppositionist direction. But it was also the 90s, so globalization was in absolute ascension. And the Comintern wasn't hiring anymore. So with my educational background, with my specialization, I actually ended up doing a series of jobs for the American Defense Department, for the World Bank, for a lot of these organizations that really spearhead the international order. And that's where I get a lot of the insight. It also felt like the final step in my education, understanding how systems of power operate, understanding what these organizations, what these institutions are like. And when foreign policy questions come up, which, especially ones that are adjacent to defense or DC politics, I spent years working in DC. They call up deep state Cuba to hopefully not inform on everybody.
Nice one. Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. You know, I just realized that I never really knew all these things about you. I mean, sporadically here and there you talk about those in the after shows also, but never that compact. It's really nice to hear that. So, last but not least, of course, Gene, how about you? Where are you coming from and how did you end up here?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, my mother is from Wales, from a working class background, and my father was a medical doctor, an immigrant to the United States, the United Kingdom from Iraqi Kurdistan. And so, you know, when I was growing up, I was always in a kind of political atmosphere. My father used to talk to me about politics. And, you know, I was brought up in a pretty comfortable middle class British sort of household. But of course, you know, like my family background and my personal, you know, the kind of like background that I was brought up in was slightly atypical in my hometown, which was a predominantly, you know, British place. There weren't large minorities of, you know, South Asians or Afro-Caribbeans there. So, you know, the relatively few people, at least until the late 1990s. So I always had a kind of interest in politics. And my mother and father were always kind of, I wouldn't say radical left like Pascal's family, but, you know, they leaned social democratic, even though the kind of, you know, milieu that sort of we lived in was sort of more conservative orientated. So, you know, I was always interested in the left side of politics, always identified with the left side of politics. And then sort of growing up, I became more and more interested in the Kurdish movement because my father is Kurdish. You know, it was the time of a big, you know, the rebellion in Turkey, the PKK insurrection. There was a lot of activism. You know, in my later teenage years before I went to university, I, you know, got to know a lot of some Kurdish immigrants from Turkey in my hometown. You know, we were kind of involved, for example, in the campaign against the Ilisu Dam. We had like people, the Ilisu Dam was a sort of big environmental project. And then when I went to university, you know, I became, you know, I wasn't sort of super active, but I was like involved, you know, protesting against the Iraq War and sort of more left-wing politics and things like that. But after university, sort of with the failure of the Iraq War opposition, the sort of disillusion with the New Labour project and what it was bringing, I kind of like became less interested in, you know, Western politics, and I became more academically orientated. You know, I went to Iraq, taught English there, you know, came back, did a master's degree, then went to Turkey for 5 years. There, you know, I got to know many people who are involved in the Kurdish movement, and particularly in the HDP, the parliamentary wing of the Kurdish movement, and the DTP, which was the sort of predecessor to the HDP. So, you know, and was sort of very interested in that. Went to do my PhD, and then, you know, during the latter times of, you know, as I was finishing off my PhD, you know, I was kind of re-enthused in politics by the rise of Corbyn, the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States, the success that the HDP was having before 2015. It felt to, you know, that things were finally beginning, at least in a small way, to go in the right direction. So, you know, I became more sort of interested in kind of overt politics rather than, you know, simply just doing academic research. And my research was focusing on the Kurdish question. And yeah, when I moved to the United States, I got to know Michael Brooks, and we wrote together in Jacobin. We wrote about Turkish affairs, we wrote about the HDP, we wrote about Syria. And, through Michael Brooks, I got to know people like Doug Lane from Zero Books. And then sort of my story with This Is Revolution was that Doug Lane and I had an idea to do a role play game stream, because these role play game streams.
Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah.
So we did a role play game.
The Mothership thing.
We played Mothership, and Jason. Yeah. I got to know Jason through Mothership, and we played a couple of games of Mothership with Doug Lane and his family. We did the streams; they were kind of fun. And then we were talking. Myself, Derek Vaughn, Doug Lane. We all discussed, and we were like, "Oh, we should totally get Jason's stream reposted on Zero Books." And so Doug, it was like, that's a great idea. And then I started being involved more with Jason. We did interviews, and then I asked Jason, hey, I can help out more with the show. And I guess I introduced Kuba, because Kuba and I met at a security conference in Iraq. And
nothing suspicious about that.
Nothing suspicious about that. But we met in a hotel, and I think Kuba was just impressed that I knew who Chapo Trap House was.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fanboy. We all are in Langley.
So basically, from that, and like Pascal says, it feels like it's been decades since we began all this. It feels like, because we communicate all quite often, and we're always trying to put together shows. So it doesn't feel like 6 months at all. It feels like.
I mean, you're also creating shit ton of content. I think you have 3 shows a week that are several hours long, and you have the after shows, and you're doing this in 6 months now. I mean, we are barely keeping up with 1 a week.
That's my fault. That's all my fault. Again, when I started doing the show, it was going to be hey, and I've said this before on the show, and I'll say it here now. Originally, it started as kind of, I don't want to say a vehicle for the band, but something for the band to do when we weren't touring. And also, there is, and this is just my opinion, a lot of woke speak and even heavy music. And we got off one of the wokest tours ever that ended with me throwing the headliner's gear into the middle of the street in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it was we need to do a show to kind of counter this woke speak, because these people that are more influential than us are telling people that they need to read Kendi. If you want to stop racism in metal, it's all about reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. Which was
once everyone reads Kendi, then Malcolm X is coming back from the dead, and racism will finally be over.
Malcolm X, not Tupac, really?
Well, no, Tupac's not dead, right? Tupac's just been occulted, right? He's with the hidden imam hanging out.
I've seen those pictures that say that Tupac's still alive, which are silly. But I had to do everything by myself, because the band, for the most part, was nah, this seems silly. No one's gonna care. So I was working at a shelter, one of the emergency shelters we have here in California, and if I could fit an interview in during a lunch break, I would. If I could fit an interview in before I left for work, when I got home, I would. I would do as much as I could, because much like touring. I don't know if you've ever heard this before. I know some of you guys are musicians. If you do it for 7 years, maybe you could be an overnight success, or something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
So that's why when I had my first band, Le Fin Absolu du Monde, we toured 150 shows a year, because we're fuck it, we'll get this 7 years in 2, right? It didn't work out that way. So but I had a mentality for this, and that's when my buddy that actually did the graphic design was look, do it 1 day a week, because you do too fucking much, and it's too hard for people to find. And then with Pascal, we went from every Tuesday and then somebody couldn't make it on a Tuesday, and then we had like 2 Thursdays in a row, and then one day someone couldn't make it on a Tuesday or a Thursday, and I was like, well, let's try out Saturday. And Saturday has become the quote unquote free show. Thursday has become foreign policy. And Tuesday is kind of the interview with an author or an academic or just some. Ultimately, it boils down to there's a lot of people that I just like to talk to. And this show gives me an outlet to talk to and have conversations that I don't think the average person gets to hear, even in left media spaces. Like our show in about Iran is a show. Maybe you get the Mossadegh story, but that's about it. It kind of stops there. Maybe you get the war story, but that's about it, and it stops there. So the reason why I feel like Jean and Kuba are such huge additions to the show is because they spent so much time with the deeper dive context of why and how. And when people understand the why and the how, now you understand why you want to push back against global hegemony instead of just accepting it.
You know, the funny thing is that, I mean, I really think that this is like one of the things that makes you guys so unique is the amount of time and also the like the quality of the guests that you have on and the amount of time that you offer them to speak and then even maybe continue in the after shows. Because, I mean, interestingly, I mean, even before knowing you guys, that was also kind of our concept. So we also wanted to have deep dive, long interviews, like 60 minutes, 90 minutes, something like that, you know, at least, and then maybe an after show afterwards, in order to do exactly that. But I wanted to talk about the podcast in a second. I think we always ask our guests like a typical question that Daniel likes to ask.
Yeah,
so
it's actually one of my favorite questions because the answers are always so inspiring. The question is pretty simple. Could you please, each of you, name 3 characters, 3 people that have been hugely influential to you, be it politically or generally? Who would you name if I say, give me a list of 3 people who made up your mind as it is today? It doesn't need to be like one for the ages. It can be a very spontaneous one and a little bit fluent. But so, who wants to start?
You want to go, Pascal?
I think for me, there's no question that the first person I have to say is Bruce Dixon from Black Agenda Report. Bruce Dixon was a former Black Panther who had been a long time activist on the left, and he was a writer for Black Agenda Report. He started writing for Black Commentator, and we became very close friends. And he was kind of a mentor to me over the period of almost 10 years. We knew each other. We would talk 2 or 3 times a week personally. And it became a long-term political education project, because what I eventually learned is that Bruce Dixon was actually in charge of political education for the Chicago Black Panther Party during the time of Fred Hampton. So I was getting a political education from the guy who was doing political education at a time when, you know, it was, you know, serious. So I think for him, I could definitely say that he was one of the people that really introduced me to having a different worldview of Black politics. I would definitely say that Adolph Reed's work is seminal in terms of shaping. And as a matter of fact, it was Bruce that introduced me to Adolph, and they both had a kind of simpatico worldview in terms of understanding class relative to Black politics. So I would say the 2 of them were very, very important in terms of my worldview. The third person that I would have to say in terms of my personal development would have to be my uncle Ulrich in New York, who I grew up with, believe it or not, was part of, I call them the 3 Musketeers, which is my dad, my uncle Ulrich, and my uncle Claude, which were the 3 paternal family members that I grew up with in New York, who would talk, kind of at the center of that every weekend, dominoes, rum, vodka, politics kind of circle. And my uncle Ulrich is really kind of one of the last of that crew that's still alive. So I still talk to him about politics. I'll give you, if you can indulge me, let me give you a brief anecdote
of course.
about my uncle
Go
Ulrich.
ahead.
I was not from an early point, I was not a supporter of Obama, but I had never really talked to my uncle Ulrich about Obama, but he had never had anything pleasant to say to him. So at one point, like towards the end of the Obama presidency, this is like in 2017, I asked him, I said, why is it that you never really had anything kind or positive to say about Obama? And I had never told him about my opinions, even though I had never given you my opinions. And he said something. He said, I realized early on that what the Americans had done with Obama was something that they pulled out of a Haitian political playbook. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm like, you're out of your mind. What are you talking about? Then he says, no, he says, this is la politique de doublure. I was like, what the hell is that? He says, la politique de doublure was a tactic that the fair complexion mulatto elite would use in Haiti, where they would take a dark complexion candidate and they would run him to be their tool, and the black majority would support him because he thought they represented him. And then when he got into power, he would betray them and fulfill the political agenda of the mulatto elite. And he said, I've never supported Obama because I realized that the United States had implemented la politique de doublure in the United States, and they were doing it to black people. And I didn't think that they would ever get over it because I thought it was particularly cruel. So, having a guy like that who can give you that kind of political education from your childhood is, for me, something that is still valuable to this day. I just talked to Ulrich on Friday, and he's still just giving out wisdom like that to this day to me. So he would be the third person, I think, out of all of my three.
Nice. It's beautiful. Really beautiful.
Go, Gene. You're muted.
You're muted.
You go first, Jason. I still have to think about this. This is a tough question.
It is a tough question. I would say my grandparents. My grandfather was a bishop of several churches throughout Northern California, and when I was very young, I stayed with my grandparents quite a bit. He died when I was 9, but before that, sorry, you probably listened. My son is running all over the place. Before that, some days I used to get to leave school. My grandfather would get a wild bird in his britches, and he'd say to my grandmother, put the boys' clothes on them. So it means I had to get dressed nice, and I would go with my grandfather all day. Wouldn't go to school, and we'd hang out, and he'd go to hospitals and hang out with cancer patients and people that were dying. We'd go to schools, kind of all over the community. And that was a big thing for him, was getting the community involved, because he comes from that old school era of churches. This is before mega churches. I think even if he would have lived through the era of mega churches, he probably wouldn't have really appreciated what they stood for. He even started his church by knocking on every door in North Richmond, which is still a very poor and depressed area, and telling people, I'll have my wife come pick your kid up, and if you don't have any clothes for them, or if you can't afford to do their hair, feed them, I'll do that for you. Right. And this is all pre-Panthers. This is just what, and there was a lot of church, and Pascal can attest to this, there was a lot of church organizations actually that did this back in the day in their community. So kind of growing up around that vibe taught me a lot. Right. And then maybe my mom, seeing someone get radicalized at such a late stage in their life. She went from, kind of an average person who had a really bad time with narcotics to being a pretty big time organizer, activist. She gets flown all over to help organize. She's been part of the Fight for 15, which is a raise in our minimum wage pretty much since the beginning. She's been part of programs to unionize Walmart. So for me internally, I think that's where I get that shit from.
Wow. Awesome. Thanks. I think your mom is also watching your show. And
my mom, yeah, she's an interesting character, before, again, like I said, growing up, she was very, very rough. Now when I go drop my son off and see her, she's had a different DSA shirt on every day. She's an awesome lady.
Nice. Very good. So
That was only one, Jason. That was only
three.
Yeah,
There's grandparents and mom.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
grandparents are two,
Mom.
I guess. Yeah.
He cheated a little bit, but that's okay. So,
Yeah.
just
They were both very large figures in the community who had my grandfather's funeral, I think, was 2 weeks long because so many people from all over the country had to come pay their respects. To this day, if people find out I'm his grandkid, it's pretty interesting.
I didn't know you were a prince.
A little bit.
okay.
So, Gene, how about you?
I mean, yeah, I'm going to be pretty uninteresting again and say, the first influence in my life on my sort of political development was definitely my father. Me and my dad do not agree on everything these days. We have my dad is like a kind of is a Kurdish nationalist and has some pretty unreconstructed views on Arabs and Persians and Turks and things like that. The typical kind of secular nationalist stance that many Middle Eastern sort of professional managerial class types from the 1970s, 60s, and 70s have towards Islam and things like that. So like me and my dad have a lot of political differences, but on the flip side, my dad was the first person to sort of really talk to me extensively about politics from a very young age. On the drive to school, we used to listen to the Today program, which is the BBC's sort of flagship news program in the morning. We would discuss political events, whether they were at home and abroad. My dad introduced me to a lot of different concepts, and gave me that kind of interest in politics. So even though we disagree, without his influence, I don't think I would have been so interested from such a young age to think about politics and understand that politics was something important. My dad, for someone brought up in a Middle Eastern context, was pretty atypical in that he was, not trying to force me down like to be an engineer or a medical doctor, but like to have a kind of a broad understanding of the world, and he had a lot of respect for like history and things like that. So there's no doubt that sort of the first political influence on my life was my father's. When it comes to kind of politics in general, there's both kind of the abstract sense and the kind of like personal sense of it. So definitely in more recent times, what's got me away from sort of being purely in the academic realm and kind of like excluding myself from like the general discussions of politics to just sort of engage in the academic navel gazing, which I think sometimes it's not fair. Some academics do engage in public discourse, but obviously there's often a prejudice against academics becoming too popular or trying to engage in these things, public debates, or intervene in public debates more. But yeah, like there's two influences on that. One is obviously Jeremy Corbyn's political campaign, which I found, after years in which, from basically from the Iraq War, I totally sort of given up like any hope that there's any meaningful politics on the left could ever do anything beyond just complaining and deconstructing. And although the Corbyn experiment failed, there's no doubt that candidacy was extremely important to me in getting me to like re-engage with politics after sort of just becoming purely cynical. It's very easy to sit there and say, this is trash. No, nothing works. But, it was a moment for me where I was like, no, this is an opportunity for a kind of left political agenda. We can be critical of it, but, this is actually a real game. So sort of in that sense, that Corbyn's candidacy, rather than Corbyn himself, obviously, I did meet Corbyn ages ago, but this was when he was doing sort of Kurdish solidarity work in the parliament. But beyond, his candidacy was very important to me. And then, in a more personal sense, Michael Brooks was one of the people who got me to engage with the media sphere. We worked together, we wrote together, we discussed things very much. He would talk to me. We talked a lot about left media, what the function of left media was, he was, quite a media savvy person. So, him bringing me on to kind of like the TMBS crew, like bringing me on to Majority Report and discuss, talking about like what was the objective of left media. That was something which I found very influential on me, especially after I moved to the United States, which, in 2016, it was a new country to me. So, that I would say those three figures, one very personal, one kind of like a political figure, and another sort of somebody who I got to know in my professional life. Those three were probably the triumvirate that I would say has been pretty influential on me.
Awesome, great, thanks for that.
Cooper's going to start with Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
Yeah, Henry Kissinger, or as I call him, Daddy.
The Dulles brothers and Henry Kissinger. That's right.
My family also very, very influential on my own interests and my own thinking about the world. I brought this up when I told you a little bit of my story and where I come from. So I won't repeat that. One intellectual interest, one intellectual influence on me was Peter Weiss, especially the play Marasad, which kind of black-pilled me in terms of combining my leftist political orientation with some relatively challenging observations about human psychology, the nature of revolutions, the possible negative consequences of political action, left or right, which ultimately it's very difficult to be a Polish leftist because you have to square the fact that on the one hand, you have these ideological commitments towards equality, towards workers' rights, towards cosmopolitanism that culminate in socialism. On the other hand, wow, did the People's Republic suck? And wow, everyone hates it. And it's becomes very challenging to explain why things went so badly wrong with the real lived socialism experienced in the Eastern Bloc, especially while, you could see 200-300 miles away in West Germany, people having the time of their lives, and not just people, not just any people, Germans, so the wrong people in the post-1945 context. While Poland, that morally considered itself to have done everything right, languished behind the Iron Curtain with Stalin's boot heel on its throat. And that was communism. That was socialism. So Weiss kind of gave me a more nuanced way of trying to understand the contradictions between ideology and practice, between theory and reality. So another balancing force, I'd say, are the three gentlemen that I'm appearing with today. My participation in, or my career as a globalist defense analyst, PMC, was largely a product of that kind of pessimism. The Comintern isn't hiring. The Pentagon is. Better to be, at least upper middle class than poor. So I will drink the Tsar's kopeck, and I'll work for the empire. The prospect that you could do anything effective from a left political position, that didn't occur to me until Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. And the idea that I could be part of that didn't occur to me until I was basically invited on this show. And so it was very meaningful and inspiring to join a community that was committed to a positive leftist political program and that actually wanted my contribution to it. And so, you know, like, gentlemen, thank you. Finally, and most importantly, I can't name or even be that specific about the third person, because it's a classmate of mine from undergrad who, extraordinary academic career, a person of diversity. I'm not going to specify what kind, but the type of individual that woke political operatives like to push forward, and a Republican to boot, right wing, brilliant economic and judicial mind, stellar career, ambitions of going on to the federal bench, maybe even the Supreme Court. Also absolute monster, not just in a kind of we're ideologically opposed sense, but credible allegations of violence against people, against women, against animals. Lots of incipient suggestions behaviorally of narcissism, psychopathy, and also complete protection when anyone has made allegations about this person's behavior to police, to administrators, to influential political figures. That has always been swept under the rug, put aside, pinned, binned, allowing them to step from a very badly, an atrocious record of personal behavior as an undergraduate to one of the most competitive and prestigious law schools in the world, one of the most prestigious post at that law school, and then higher and higher achievements in the field of American law, to the point where this individual is already a very strong influence on policy and legal outcomes, always in a terrible way. They're the kind of lawyer that defends big tobacco and Bill Cosby and Citizens United, without any clear limit to how far they can ascend. And this person is a bit of an outlier in terms of how terrible they are, but there are many others that fill out a similar profile of career advancement, terrible political and economic commitments, and questionable personal ethics that collectively, they sit in Congress, they manage large corporations, they operate in ways that shape reality for millions of other people. And knowing that that's who sits in these posts forces me to try to take the opposite position.
That's insane.
Wow. Awesome. I mean,
I think this is the
first time. Yeah, go ahead. You say it.
That's, that's the first time that somebody gave a negative example as something that was very much shaping the way that they think. I find this very interesting.
Yeah, it's like the first time
how
that this
not
question
to be
turned
that guy,
dark.
how
basically.
how to avoid those motherfuckers taking power.
Well, if they're in charge during the climate crisis, if they're in charge during when a wave of 1 million to 5 million refugees move from climate-ravaged countries to arrive in the EU, to arrive in the United States, if they're in charge the next financial crisis hits, the carnage, the consequences will be incalculable, both in terms of human misery and the fact that you'll entrench terrible outcomes and terrible institutions for another 100 years.
The ocean's literally on fire right now in the Gulf of Mexico.
I want to say, if you guys can indulge me, right? You know, I think that probably on the show, I give Cuba like the most crap for being deep state Cuba, being State Department asset.
How many times have you threatened to Mau me?
But I gotta take and Cuba may not believe this, but I have profound admiration and affection for Cuba, and I really I appreciate his ability to transparently state, like, you know, the ruling class sucks behind, and not from like an abstract. You know, I mean, you know, I went to a pretty competitive law school. I've been around these people my whole life. But, you know, in terms of the intelligence apparatus, I've never really been entrenched in that kind of space where I'm really up close with individuals who are apparatchiks of the ruling class, really, really, in terms of them making their decisions and how they affect the world. And I appreciate that, you know, Cuba, and it doesn't have to be from any kind of just like left radical analysis. He's just like, these people suck. Like, they really just kind of just really, like, they're not, you know, they might be smart or brilliant, but they're really like not benevolent human beings in terms of how they rule their world. They're just kind of cogs in the wheel. And I find that contribution, I've never told you, but I think it's very important to the show for me to have him to be able to bring that into the mixture. You know, as much as I may think some of his foreign policy analysis is a little conservative for my taste, but I think it's a very important contribution for me personally. Anyway,
thank you, Pascal.
And I'd like to I would like to add as well that one of the problems I think on left media in general is that a lot of people in the left don't actually understand the mechanisms of power. Like Pascal says, everything is understood from an abstract context, and there is almost a disdain for understanding the inner workings and mechanisms of not only foreign policy, but also domestic policy. I remember talking to a very well-known professor, a very highly respected sort of left-wing professor who's based in the United Kingdom, who just had no conception about how decisions are made. I'm not as well versed in this stuff as Cooper is, but I've seen foreign policy apparatchiks, operate. I worked at the American University of Iraq, where the dean was the head of the university is now the president of Iraq. My wife worked for the president, the current president of Iraq. So, and we met, all these kind of people. We spoke to, and the left is so distant from power. It often doesn't conceive of how these things, how the sausage is made, right?
It mystifies.
It mystifies. Yeah,
power is such a bad word, right? I was with a person that actually was on the Michael Brooks show quite a bit, who lives out here, and we went on a hike in Oakland a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the left in general, and he had echoed with that without even knowing Pascal, a lot of Pascal's sentiments about the weakness of the left. And one thing and this guy comes from a big time organizing, and he said there's just no structure in place like the right has. The right wing in the US has a structure in place where they put, like Akuba was saying, judges on benches for federal courts and Supreme Courts. There's no one on the left even going to law school. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We had Fred Hampton's lawyers, a gentleman named Flint Taylor, on the show that's been part of the People's Law Office for the better part of 50 years. Mm-hmm. But the climate has changed financially so much where you can't be, a white kid, an idealistic white kid from the East to move to Chicago to help out the cause for $100 a week anymore. Like he did for so long. So many people are so strapped by student debt. Couple that with the fact that there's just no understanding. It's really hard to get a grip on the inner workings of power, so you just ignore it for the most part. And even in the podcast sphere, like we did a show where we were, I wouldn't say going at each other's throats, but it definitely a fun heated, I say, because I would think that we're all very good friends. And a lot of it had to do with the Afghanistan papers that came out in the Washington Post that were all these redacted documents, but so bad to the point there was like higher ups in the State Department that were actually asking U.S. generals who the bad guys were. You know what I mean? So that story got no run in the left podcast sphere, in the media sphere, because it's too much of a complex story to tell and nobody wants to tell it.
Well, I remember when after September 11th, there was a period of time where Al-Qaeda was supposed to be this like specter level evil international organization, right? The evil genius theory of jihad, right? They're sitting in their caves with their maps and plotting. And then when studies were actually made of who the hijackers were and who gets attracted, what types of people get attracted to radical Islamic groups, it's like a bunch of guys. It's the same as a bowling league or the same as a leftist podcast. It's a social dynamic. People are looking for community, and it's not some kind of best and brightest, only one can advance, ultra elite. And once you realize that, then the flip side of it becomes clear too. If terrorist attacks succeed and it's a bunch of guys, who's stopping them? And we have this notion that the security apparatus, the FBI, the CIA, are staffed by the best and the brightest. They have all of the information. They have all of the technology. They have plans. They have schemes. They have a system for the entire world. But it's a bunch of guys. It's a bunch of bureaucrats in the analytics and planning wing, and it's a bunch of meathead jocks in the clandestine wing. And some of them are smart, but the ones who are, in a good American way, apply their intelligence largely to personal professional advancement and not towards some big ideological vision.
Yeah, they're basically careerists, divorced of, and this is the one thing that I realized going to law school and being around these kind of people who eventually kind of populate, is that like the only depth that they have is the degree to which they want to advance their resume, you know. And this is the thing that I used to say about Obama, because people used to say it was like, Obama's really brilliant, he's a genius. I was like, no, he's not. You know, I've known people like Obama. I went to law school. I went to Boston University, which is law school right across the river from Harvard. And I'm not saying that people like Obama were not smart. They were smart in a kind of way, but these people had no vision. They were careerists.
Like Buttigieg. Buttigieg is another example.
Yeah. In other words, is that, you know, they were not visionary people. They were people who, they were smart. It's like they're people who are smart at playing chess, but they're not going to be grandmasters. You know what I'm saying? They know how to move the pieces. They're good. I mean, they know how to do what it takes to advance their careers. But, you know, when Obama talks about like all the books he's read, you think that Obama could give you like a deep dive kind of like philosophical opinion on Marx's 18th Brumaire? Of course not. But he was like, oh yeah, I read it, and yeah, I read Marcuse, and you know, he read it like most of those knobheads read it in their graduate school seminars or whatnot. And I'm not saying that even, you know, I'm not even saying that he should be able to do that, right? But the notion that technocratic bureaucrats are necessarily brilliant or some kind of super intellects, I think is something that is being disproven in real time in terms of how the world is run and governed, in my humble opinion.
And the political economy of American education in particular drives these kind of careers in a certain direction. It drives the talent in a certain direction. As you mentioned with the law, you go into a good law school, you end up with a huge amount of debt. Well, the only way to pay back that debt is through some kind of like state service, or in the private sector. Doing public defender work won't do that. You're a scientist or a computer engineer. Are you going to your work is going to be directed towards, I think Kuba mentioned it once, like finding a sex app
for old people.
For old people or something like that, using your talents in that direction. So the political economy works in that way. And then to Pascal's point, you have a whole load of degree programs. Now, I'm less familiar with the United States, but I assume the Ivies are the same. But, at a place like Oxford or Cambridge, you have this degree, PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, which is basically a finishing school, which allows sort of elite kids to be able to speak superficially on a large amount of subjects, but not go into depth in anything. So if you look at the English ruling class, the conservative ruling class, they all come out of these elite schools, the British system is slightly more meritocratic than the American system, but if they get into the elite school, they do this PPE project and they make connections and they can appear extremely knowledgeable on something. They will know the names of a few. I remember a very good example. When I was doing my PhD, I had to show David Miliband around the college. David Miliband is the brother of Ed Miliband, who was the leader of the Labour Party. David Miliband was a foreign secretary, and he was like, "What do you study?" And it's like, "Oh, I study, I do Ottoman and Turkish history." And he goes, "I'm very hopeful for democratization on Turkey because of X, Y, and Z." And I'm like, "Bro, what are you talking about?"
Shut up, man. Shut up.
I didn't say that, obviously. And of
delete
course,
your account.
He had his little flunky with him, Ollie. This is Ollie, and he's so that you have this kind of elite education that encourages, basically teaches you how to bullshit. And I'm sure
debate team is
debate team sort of education. And so to the proles, or to the average sort of middle class sort of people who did not go to those prestigious institutions, this seems like that they know what they're talking about, but really it's kind of like, and this is not to say that there aren't brilliant people out there, but there's a lot of overestimation of what these people can do, as if they have some kind of preternatural power to understand politics, history, philosophy in a very deep way, in which they don't. They just know a few terms to make themselves sound knowledgeable on a particular topic.
And when I was an undergrad, there were, and this repeated itself when I was at Berkeley for graduate school, but there's fields and careers that you're implicitly signaled are the high status paths. That when I was at Harvard, it was finance. If you went into Goldman Sachs, if you got recruited by Goldman Sachs, then that made you the sexiest, most attractive, most assertive. You were the alpha male of the entire class, and even if you were a female, your lady balls were the biggest, and that clearly oriented the entire undergraduate population. Even if there were people who pursued other paths, you knew where the talent was supposed to go, and you tended to defer uncritically to the people who could bring out their, Wall Street bona fides. When I was at Berkeley, it had shifted a little to the tech sector. Google, Apple, Facebook, or, any startup that was going to help pets meet old people for play dates in smoke-free, anti-racist environments or something.
I wish that was a real app.
Maybe we should start it and then use that to fund the podcast.
Yeah, we get some money for that. Just thinking about that right now. Fuck it. That's the new project.
Okay.
And
We're
you-
both
ma-
techies.
Maybe you have
Stephen and I.
you have like options that you can click, like anti-racist, nonce.
Racist,
It's cat.
racist for racist cat people. You know.
So people have racist dogs.
Turfs
Yeah.
only parakeet meetup.
Oh yeah, the anti-racist dog, exactly.
And even if nobody else was interested, you could sell it to the CIA for domestic extremism.
And basically, for these elite schools, academia is the place that you kind of wash out to. You know, it's like if you don't want to brutalize people, or at least aren't willing to be, you know, like do that stuff, you attempt to get into academia, because it's kind of like, it's like being a monk. You go up to like, so you're an ascetic monk. You go up to your ivory tower and like just sit around with students all the time. So that's the kind of like only sort of respectable way out if you don't have the killer instinct. You can go, you go try and be a professor. Otherwise, you have to like join one of these like institutions as a captain of either industry or sort of state management, and then academics for the people with the soft hearts, or who buy the lefty stuff like too much.
Stage one of any successful PMC career is make $20 million. And most people don't realize that you can get stuck at stage one forever if you pursue that route. But until you have that $20 million, your classmates will be like, oh, professor, that's cute. Oh, a doctor. That's so you like help people. That's nice.
What I think is really interesting, because we have like socially, we have entirely different structures in Germany. We have like we have state-funded universities, etc. But funnily enough, the results are pretty fucking similar. So,
Thank you, The Economist.
Well, international capital is international capital for a reason.
Yeah.
You know,
We should make a different episode on that topic, because I think, I mean, in the German context, maybe we could get Sarah Noyes in. She was also working here at the university, and I have some friends here who are from the US actually working here in Germany at the university, and they also tell me some pretty gruesome stories about the bureaucracy here.
Well, it's more
here
like
and the
feudalism in
structures.
German academia is more like feudalism.
It's not this kind of business atmosphere. It's really like strong hierarchies that are obvious to everyone, and everyone has to submit. But I want to change gears a little bit, because I have so many questions prepared, and I have like maybe one or two before we go to the after show. So let's. I think this one is quite important, and there were also some people in the chat that were already asking this because of some comments that you guys made. So let me say it like this. So normally, in my experience, what I have witnessed is that certain political and also academic discourses from the US reached Europe, and especially German discourse always like a couple of years later. So for example, one of the trends that has been central to US politics in let's say the last decade, but I think is now cooling off a little bit, or at least there is a lot of criticism also arising from the left, has been all this, this topic about identity politics, woke type, anti-racism, critical race theory, and all this stuff is now slowly but surely reaching also the German mainstream. Yeah. So, for example, I know friends now that they suggest to read Robin DiAngelo, for example. Right?
Oh, this is so brutal.
Yeah.
So, why?
They're not your friends.
No, they're colleagues. Colleagues.
Going around saying
So,
the N-word or something? Where you need
no, it's exactly like that. Yeah. No, and then all the while, economic universal questions of inequality and class get more and more marginalized. It's not that we were talking about class all the time, but it becomes more difficult in this kind of supposed conflict between these identity politics and class politics. So what I want to ask you is, like, given the premise, and I know this is highly reductionist, but given the premise that a lot of the political and social trends that are happening in the US at least get partially replicated in Germany, maybe with some time delay, what would you recommend, based on your experience and the fights that you are fighting also, what the German left should learn from you guys, or maybe do differently than you?
Oh, I'd like to make up. I think that the most important thing that they can learn from our podcast, in my opinion, and Jason can correct me and anyone else, is that the particular way in which racism is used as a tool by the ruling class to maintain hierarchies that disadvantage most Black people from politics that can help them.
Mm-hmm.
And that type of utility can be used as a metaphor for the variety of identities that you're talking about.
Of course, yeah.
The most important thing that you can get is that identity politics in America is not something that is being pushed generally by the identities that the people are referring to. It is a ruling class mechanism by using elites who have those racial makeups to push an agenda that is particularly rooted in promoting a neoliberal concept of diversity, which means Blacker, browner, more feminine, and more gayer seats at the table of 5, while the rest of everyone else is eating crumbs.
And I agree absolutely with Pascal. And one thing that I'd add is that the left, if it goes down the route of too strong an emphasis on symbolic politics in terms of using correct nomenclature and being especially sensitive to things like cultural appropriation or symbolic expressions of what could be considered disrespect or white supremacy or German chauvinism, or you name it, then you're going to, it's a never-ending cycle of auto-cannibalization. You're going to waste an incredible amount of energy policing essentially people's thoughts, feelings, inadvertent expressions. You're going to undermine your own civic, libertarian, personal freedom institutions because somebody's going to try to pursue some kind of government or corporate enforcement of those codes of expression. And you're going to attract a bad element of individuals who will weaponize the guilt and shame and apologies, like what happened to Jeremy Corbyn about the anti-Semitism accusations. If you take those accusations in good faith, then you've already lost the battle, because a bad faith accuser will never be satisfied. And the amount of self-censorship that will happen under those circumstances is also devastating to any political movement that seeks to speak to a broad range of people and to hear and to listen to a broad range of views. The working class isn't that woke. You know, workers will say things that will trigger other people. And if you're busy policing discourse, then you're going to get a smaller, more elite, and more mutually destructive leftist political scene.
And I think one of the critical points that we have to make here is that, you know, a lot of the sort of woke policing is done from a very like condescending and arrogant and punitive perspective. Of course, we should engage with people to get them to challenge prejudices that they might have on racial, gender, or sexual orientation ground. But that has to be approached with sympathy and care, and not like consigning people to like being permanently evil people. And we also have to understand, for elements of certain groups that have been excluded from the power structure when, you know, power structures were dominated by men and, predominantly white men, a lot of this sort of woke ideology is a kind of ideological tool or battering ram that can be used to make claims, as Pascal says, to a chair at that table of 5 people. And if you want to look where this aesthetic of radical politics will lead you to, it leads you to a politician like Kirsten Sinema, who signals and dresses as someone radical, but in fact pursues a reactionary political agenda. So we have to sort of fight a two-front war. We have to avoid the kind of, in Britain we have Spiked, or the kind of post-left people who are completely dismissive of any discussion of race, gender, sexuality. We have to avoid that dead end, while at the same time avoid the kind of very falling into the kind of bourgeois morality, liberal morality, which becomes hegemonic on certain elements of the left. They appropriate this liberal ideology and reproduce it. We have to kind of navigate this very difficult path, which isn't easy, but we have to find a way to do that.
That's very important, and Gene makes a very good point, is that the goal is not to ignore that people are marginalized because of their race, ethnicity, or gender. When our goal is not, definitely not my goal, and I don't think it's anyone's goal here, is to go back to 1965 when all wealth and power were concentrated by white Anglo-Saxon men in America, or white European men, particularly in the West. That's not what our goal is. But what we all, at the same time, we have to realize that people are going to use that history of racial antagonism to promote solutions that are about simply maintaining capitalist hierarchy in the name of diversity in a way that will still disproportionately negatively affect the Black, brown, female, or even gay communities they claim to help. And I want to give a perfect example of this, if you will indulge me. And I want to pivot to Jason, because I know Jason has something important to say, is that Jamie Dimon, who I believe was president now of JP Morgan. He was president of Citibank at a certain point. I don't know if he's at Citibank or JP Morgan now. Morgan. He's at Morgan now. Okay. Jamie Dimon, big time 1% capitalist, infamous, 1%er in terms of protecting the high interests of the financial services sector. Jamie Dimon, there's a picture of him taking a knee, sit on one knee during the George Floyd protest era, signaling his sympathy for Black Lives Matter. And there are articles, you can Google this, Jamie Dimon, racial wealth gap. Jamie Dimon talking about the importance of fighting the racial wealth gap. First of all, the first question you have to ask is that what institutions are probably more instrumental in creating wealth gaps of any type than banks?
Yeah, good point.
Especially Wall Street high finance. We're not talking about a credit union. We're not talking about this is a wonderful life.
JP Morgan Chase, all right? Number one. Number two, at the same time, Jamie Dimon is waxing rhapsodic about the dangers of the racial wealth gap. He is fighting tooth and nail against Medicare for all, which would disproportionately benefit poor and working class Black and brown people who have all types of comorbidities.
Can you say that again? Can you say that again for the people in the back, please?
I'll say that again for the people in the back. At the same time, Jamie Dimon is arguing and stating his support for methods to fight the racial wealth gap. He is fighting tooth and nail against Medicare for All, which is a program that Black and brown people who have various health comorbidities because of poverty would disproportionately benefit from. Another example is someone like David Brooks, who is a reactionary right-wing troll who works for the Manhattan Institute, which, as Cuba and everyone else would know, is a right-wing pro-finance capital institution. Writes for the New York Times. David Brooks.
He also believes that the perfect relationship is with your research assistant. Is that not correct?
That
Is he?
But David Brooks, who comes out of a hardcore neoliberal right-wing financial institution, writes a piece in the New York Times, "My support for reparations." Well, now you got to ask yourself, why would a guy who comes out of the Manhattan Institute, who's a right-winger, write a piece talking about he supports for reparations? Because he realizes that reparations within the capitalist hierarchy can be framed to be anything you want, especially something you want that doesn't challenge capitalist hierarchy.
I think that you're actually giving him too much credit. He doesn't think that. He has internalized that because Jamie Dimon thinks that.
No, Evanston, Illinois is a great example. It's like a grant program, right? That's going to give loans to Black people that have to prove that they were discriminated against. Have fun with that one. In a certain period of time in Evanston, Illinois, and it was labeled a reparations. Even people like Darity, Sandy Darity, speaks about Japanese reparations, which wasn't really that much money considering you're talking about a people that literally lost everything. And by the time they got that little bit of money, it wasn't even enough to pay for their kids to go to college.
I mean, think about this. Jason and I, we talk about this all the time. And is that you have Amazon, the company Amazon, that is financing productions on Amazon Prime, and in what I call, in my last piece I did about the Great Awakening, I call Black trauma porn. Black trauma porn, meaning all of these depictions of the historical tragedies of racism going back to slavery and Jim Crow, which, I mean, obviously, it creates a certain emotional reaction. So you have Amazon, doing, for example, you go on Amazon Prime, you see the whole kind of label, we support Black Lives Matter, blah, 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 so on and so forth. But yet Amazon, which has a large Black population, has Black people peeing in cups during breaks.
Yes.
Because
those aren't Black people, those are workers.
Yeah, those are workers, but many of them are Black people.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Once you're an employee of Amazon, then your race doesn't matter anymore. Right, it only triggers the identity politics.
Because when you talk about working class people, you're talking about white men in the consciousness of this.
And they've become despised too, right? It used to be that you could shit on all of the working class except the brave white men of the steel industry and the hard hat construction workers. And now, thanks to progress, you can shit on the entire working class.
And it shows you the overlap between, you look at a figure like J.D. Vance, right, who,
Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah, Hillbilly Elegy. Around 2000, around Trump's election and stuff like that, he was very popular amongst the liberal media establishment. Why was that? The guy is basically a Thomas Sowell of Appalachia who goes around and tells people the reason Appalachia is poor is not because of deindustrialization and the injection of opioids into the region, but because they're culturally deficient and lazy people. This is like a sort of a culturalist argument, and that they spend their money on flat screen TVs and mobile phones. And this was popular amongst liberals because it appealed to liberal prejudices about what people in flyover country are like. Because liberals have many of the same ideological pathologies that conservatives have. It's just that they assign those to different communities.
And let's be honest, it's what you see. I'm just speaking about what you see. I've spent a lot of time in West Virginia. If you dig on the internet enough, there's a picture of me fucking around on a stripper pole in West Virginia, right? Love West.
We need to do an episode about
that. Gotta write that down. Yeah.
I am clothed, but it's pretty funny. But you go to West Virginia and you do see a fuck ton. That's a lot. I know. I keep forgetting we're in Germany. Of people that are
you can curse
extremely
a fuck kilogram.
A fuck kilogram.
But a ton is 1,000 kilograms, so I think
they're on those rascal scooters because they can't walk. Diabetes is on another level. The illegal economy from opioids keep the small markets open. So when JD Vance talks about it's not the coal mines, it's people's need to want to have satellite televisions and eat like shit. And that's why. It's what you see. And if I go out the door and I see that, and again, I watch the news on my satellite, and there's 150 news channels that are reiterating the same thing in some way, shape, or form. It's very easy for people to believe that. Again, why I think it is important to have the deeper dive conversation into the mechanisms of why, because why isn't always just personal choice. Where you guys live, I know for a fact there's somebody saying, you know what the problem is? It's these dirty ass motherfucking refugees. Look at them. They don't wash. They do this, they do that. It's a deeper conversation that people don't want to have, but it's just what I see.
And I think that in the United States and in Canada too, the Germany might be a little different, but in a lot of Western countries, there's a strong commitment to the idea of a just world or a just society, that things can't be that bad because the system is fair, and if you work hard and you play by the rules, you'll get ahead. So if anybody is suffering, it must somehow be because they did something wrong. If you're sympathetic, they made a mistake. If you're not sympathetic, then they're bad. They're just lazy, or they're criminals, or there's something else that's wrong with them. So they're where they should be. They're where they deserve to be. The world is just. I can sleep in peace. And challenging that, right? Getting to a point where people can accept that this is an unjust world is difficult, especially when, as in the United States, there's an entire educational system, an entire cultural apparatus, an entire spiritual system that is placed to reinforce the notion that this is good, this is just, the world is fair, and we are the greatest country that ever was or will be. And that's something that the left always has to fight against.
Well, one of the things that I think that we really have to understand, and it's very easy to lose perspective of this, is that it is very, very, very dangerous in the minds of the ruling class, in America particularly, that you have young kids in this country talking about challenging capitalism. The woke stuff they don't care about, the anti-racism stuff they don't care about. They're not worried about any of that stuff. And one of the things, and Jason and I talk about this all of the time, the one thing that they do not and cannot have in America is having black kids and white kids challenging capitalism. That's an absolute no-no.
Yeah. And the kids are united.
Well, you saw that with Bernie Sanders. I mean, I did a piece, or Pascal wrote a piece for Zero Books that I then turned into a video essay series that we're doing for Zero Books called The Dispatch. And the episode is called The Great Awakening. It's up on Zero.
Yeah, I saw that this morning. Yeah.
And I put a segment in there from a extremely popular black female radio host named Karen Hunter, who was vehemently opposed to Bernie Sanders. And in finding clips, I either had to, put her just giving Breonna Joy Gray, who was Bernie Sanders' press secretary, the business, where, it's like 3 or 4 black people just yelling at Breonna Joy Gray about the quote unquote class reductionist policies of Bernie Sanders, and how Bernie Sanders is racially tone deaf and he's just an old white man, which, in my opinion, Breonna Joy Gray did about as good of a job as possible to defend that notion, but I don't think she was the woman or the person, I should say the person, that was going to be the one to really get that message across with some power and some force that they were wrong. And so I put a clip in of Karen Hunter kind of going off about why she doesn't like Bernie Sanders. And it was a very silly reason. She said that he's from a place with no culture. He's from Brooklyn.
Where's Bill? Arkansas is just beaming with like black life. Bill Clinton?
Yeah. You didn't know that?
Well, what's his name? Bill Clinton did have a lot of African Americans working at the governor's palace, I believe. You know?
Oh, yeah, he was.
Were they convicts? They were convicts.
They were convicts. Yeah. But you know, I think Jason is. You know, there is definitely this extremely cynical, and it is cynical because you'll have the same people yelling about Bernie Sanders, like giving a free pass to Joe Biden, who says utterly ridiculous stuff on race, who was the architect, and it's utter. You know, these people freak. You know. Freak going nuts for Kamala Harris and things like this. So it's an utter cynical mobilization of ideology, which refuses, like, is dishonest. Because look, you look at Bernie Sanders' coalition, women and people of color. He was a guy who was doing very well. Yes, it was split up generationally, no doubt, right? You know, there was a generational split, but an utter dishonest characterization of the movement that mobilized. And it's not an accident, you know, Bernie bros, it's all white bros and things like that. This is an utter, like, you know, you want to use the woke terminology, an erasure of exactly who is supporting Bernie Sanders in order to push a very perverse and dishonest political narrative, which sells to the perceptions of white liberals that they're enlightened people who do care about race, you know, who are, you know, I was telling Pascal earlier, I've had people in Springfield, you know, upper class white liberals who tell me I should watch more Joanne Reed to understand the black experience. You know,
no, this is absurd. This is absurd.
Yeah. I mean, let me just qualify, or let you guys qualify this a little bit, because I think most people that are listening to our podcast, I mean, we also did some stuff on anti-racism, and we tried to get anti-racist scholars in that are actually looking at the thing from maybe a Marxist, maybe a historical materialist perspective. So we actually have some really good people working on this stuff in Berlin too. But it hasn't been like the dominant thing on our channel. So, and because I see some questions already in the chat. Does that mean, because, I mean, I agree with everything that you say, but does that mean that we should be, and of course you're not saying this, but I'm asking the question as a surrogate, does it mean we should oppose, for example, policies that are aiming at closing the racial wealth gap, or should we oppose reparations in general, or is there a way to run this? Or like, are we per se against, let's say, diversity or representational and
I think
these kind of policies?
I think when it comes to these types of policies, the first question to be asked is, why is this policy being framed in this way? Number one, let's deal with the racial wealth gap discourse. The racial wealth gap discourse arises literally around the 2014, 15, 16 era, around Bernie Sanders coming to power, et cetera, so on and so on. The main function of the racial wealth gap discourse, and I can tell you this because I know the effects that it has on black commentators. The main consequence of the racial wealth gap discourse is the perception that all black people are poor and all white people are rich. That is literally how it is used by black talking heads to say that all black people are poor and all black people are rich. Now, there's a disproportionate amount of poverty among black people. That's because of the way in which race is utilized in American capitalism and relegated to the reserve army of labor. You probably, if you watch our show, you've heard me talk about this several times. All of us who know anything about Marxism are not shocked by that. It's kind of Marxism 101. But at the same time, if you look at the actual data of the racial wealth gap, what's interesting is not what is different about blacks and whites in America. What's interesting is actually what's similar. And what is similar amongst blacks and whites in America is that the top 10% of whites and the top 10% of blacks own 75% of each respective group's wealth. My. So, of course, do we concede that both groups have largely different amounts of number? Because the top 10% of whites are talking about hundreds of millions and billions, and the top 10% of blacks are talking about hundreds of thousands and maybe a million. So, yes, the gap is huge. But if the top 10% of both groups have 75% of each respective group's wealth, what the hell are the rest of both groups arguing with each other about exactly? Because the rest of both groups basically have nothing.
But if I make it a racial issue, then I'm sorry, Kuba. If I make it a racial issue, then we're not arguing about the class issue. Like, you know, to the identity politics point, I had to double check. There was a huge. You would think there was a huge coup that happened. We have an organization called the ACLU that fights for a lot of free speech, right? And so Trump had overturned or had a policy. There was no transgender people in the military. And there was this huge fight, and the one of the main lawyers in the ACLU is a transgender person, and it was like a huge victory lap they were running to allow transgenders in the military. I mean, do you hear what I'm saying? Like now, you too can fight for empire. Yeah. Like, is that what equality looks like?
Yeah, like the rainbow flag on the drone that's going to strike a Yemeni market.
But I mean, the larger point that I'm trying to convey is that we should listen. We are on the left. We want to increase equality, equity, and all of those things. But we also have to understand, why are these things being pushed at this particular time? Why? Listen, reparations has been around. The discourse around reparations has been around since before I was born. Jason knows this. People were talking about reparations forever.
Time, yeah.
Do you think it's an accident that a race-based economic wealth transfer is proposed in American society at the same time socialism is becoming popular in American popular culture and society? You think that's accidental?
No, it's band-aids to hide the actual repression and exploitation going on.
And go ahead, Kuba.
And I think that in a lot of ways, when you slice up the population by identity categories and then create a hierarchy of merit and based on different levels of intersectional oppression, it allows you to move the front from Black people under George Floyd, trans people next week, then we're going to go to the Latinos. Oh wait, we don't want to let them into the country anyway. Let's go back to Black people and police brutality. And when you use intersectionality to try to parse and arrange groups by oppression, then you can end up with, all right, we're going to give reparations, but only to gay, Black, trans women. And that becomes much, much cheaper than anything that's broadly calculated to help the majority of the working class, the majority of poor people, the majority of Black people even. And
I would add, it's a matter of bandwidth. This culture war that is fought between the left and the right over issues like critical race theory or like reparations and things like that, it eats up people's intellectual bandwidth so that we're permanently fighting a political struggle as the left on issues that are kind of secondary to us. So, people will try and get into a discussion over the relative merits and demerits of critical race theory, when in fact the debate has nothing to do with critical race theory. These people getting angry or like defending critical race theory, they don't know what it's about. They haven't really read anything about it, but it becomes a cultural signifier. So
owning the libs.
Only the libs, or trying to fight back against the conservatives. And so you end up in this cultural war, which it mentally exhausts people and distracts the conversation from the conversations that we precisely need to have. And like what I say all the time is the only position that the left should be taking in these cultural wars is a position of conscientious objectors. So on issues like, for example, trans people serving in the military, that's not something the left should oppose because it's a general issue of equality. But it's not somewhere where we should be deploying our bandwidth.
Or celebrating.
Or celebrating. It's like, like obviously on a level of equality, everyone should be treated on, an equal level by the state. But like celebrating the fact that you can now get killed by a black trans woman drone operator. I mean, great. Like it's good that any victory against prejudice and inequality is a good one. But let's not deploy our mental energies, which are only finite, in certain directions. Let's not get dragged into a stupid debate over whether we like critical race theory or not, because that's not what the debate is about. It's purely a cultural camp taking place between the two wings of the ruling class, the liberal wing and the conservative wing, which drags in elements of the left, which really, should know better.
And again, my position is not to say that there's no racial. There is a racial wealth gap, of course. There's no question. My position is not to say that there's not a historical weight upon which racism and discrimination has disadvantaged Black people. I agree with that. But in my opinion, one of the most valuable guests that we had on our show, and I would implore your audience to go back to that episode, was Preston Smith II, who has a book. I have the book right here. The book is called Racial Democracy in the Black Metropolis. I go back and check that out as much as possible. Housing Policy in Post-War Chicago. And what is important about Preston's book is that he comes up with a formulation to explain two basic trends in Black political thought. One is called racial democracy, and one is called social democracy. And what I appreciate about Preston Smith is that he does something that's very important, is that if you're a student of Black political history, you will be told, and I gave Kuba a book about Black nationalism. I don't know if he's had a chance to read any of it, but you'll be told that one of the dividing points in Black thought is between integration and racial separatism. In other words, there are Black people or Black nationalists who would say, we were better when we had our own schools, our own businesses. It was when we integrated with the white people that everything fell apart. When we had our own communities and we were separate, things were better off. This is a theme that exists in Black thought. And then the perception is that you had the integrationists who said it would be better if we got in and we worked with white people. And the integrationists sold out because they wanted to be white. This is a narrative that exists. I'm not saying I agree with any of this at all. I disagree with that perception at all. But what is fascinating about Preston Smith's book is that he collapses that dichotomy. And he says it doesn't matter. He says why it doesn't matter is that the thing that is similar between the racial separatist Black nationalists and the integrationists is that they both agreed on what was called racial democracy. And racial democracy is basically a way to say race-first politics and policy. In other words, they believed in arguing with the ruling class that we need politics and policy rooted in the condition of Black people, separate from the rest of society, to address the issues of Black people. And what Preston Smith demonstrates in his book is that there was a time in Black political history when Black people asked for social democracy, which was a politics that was class-based on working class and poor Black people, that benefited all working class and poor people, and that was based on the belief that if you do policy that's good for working class and poor people, Black people will disproportionately benefit, and it's better to do social democracy. That politics was popular before the World War II era, and it was neutralized not by McCarthyism. For your audience, McCarthyism was a period after World War II that basically communism was attacked in the American ruling class. So that populism, that politics lost sway. So racial democracy or race-first politics becomes the normative disposition of Black politics, regardless if it's the Black nationalist separatists or the integrationists from the 50s onward. And what Preston Smith demonstrates is that the direct consequence of that is that an elite tier of Black people get all the benefits, and the majority of Black people who are working class and poor get ground to dust.
And I want to jump on that because race-first politics has also been the dominant framework for a lot of white politics in the United States. From the antebellum era and the institution of slavery to Jim Crow to redlining to stripping Black veterans of GI Bill benefits to the war on drugs to welfare reform, a lot of white politics has been based around treating the Black community as a separate entity with a different set of rules that apply and a different set of kind of needs and conditions, and maintaining that barrier between
which Kuba is just eloquently elaborating a theme that Jason knows that we have on the show all the time, that Black politics is what, Jason? The politics of containment.
Mm-hmm. And and I think that white supremacy has been inscribed in a lot of institutions and a lot of legal processes of the administration of the country because of that race-first white politics.
Well, think about it logically, right? If all Black people are one people, and we've created a politics where we have an elite that we can negotiate the rest of the 42 million about, doesn't it become easy to dispose of them all in one garbage can and say, got it?
Yeah. And it's in some ways the same as the British finding a chief or a prince or a Raja to put their entire native policy through during colonialism. But I also want to bring up the identity politics side from the white perspective, which is whiteness is bullshit. There's no such thing as a white language. There's no such thing as a white nation. There's no such thing as a unified white experience. What's the white? More Indian people speak English than Caucasians do. What's the white language? Is it Danish, right? Is it Greek? What's the white nation? Is it Austria? Is it Switzerland? Because it's not the United States, right? Is it Montana? Is it just Idaho? What's white culture? Is it bluegrass music? Is it Esperanto? I don't know what it is. It is all a lie. There is no basis for white racial solidarity.
Let me tell you, and I agree with Kuba, and I get a lot of grief for this because there's a whole discipline in America, Gene knows it, I think you call whiteness studies, that is premised. And there are some radical Black folk who will say white supremacy is a pan-European project. Is a pan-European project based on oppressing people of color. I was like, they shed a lot of blood amongst each other during that pan-European project, boy.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I have been at two points in my time in the United States. I was approached like I knew somebody socially, and then they outed themselves as white supremacists and tried to get me on board. Both times, it was somebody with a German surname, and I could not believe the chutzpah, if you forgive the loan or the appropriation, of a German telling a Pole that we need to be on the same race team because of the Blacks. I'm like, I have never been worried about someone like Pascal coming into Poland, putting up a camp and like killing off all my friends and family. But you guys you guys have a pretty bad track record, and I don't really.
Poland? No.
People should know that, shout out to my Haitian ancestors who gave much love to the Poles who came and fought in the Haitian Revolution. Let them, chill out to this day and have their descendants relax with their blue eyes and drinking cola la kai and listening to compa music. So
no, like the Polish political culture, unfortunately, is half fascist, but the good news is it's only half fascist, and it also has this emancipatory for your freedom and for ours legacy, Kościuszko and others. But unfortunately, like, what you have in the United States is not a white national or ethnic or cultural identity. You have a team white that gets constructed with this false solidarity. They use fear and anxiety to against people of color to link this lump of disparate, European descendants together, convince them that they have a shared set of interests, and then deploy that in order to maintain an economic hierarchy that also kicks down to a lot of poor white people.
Just to defend whiteness studies, I know a lot of it is nonsense, but I think one of the contributions of whiteness studies, at the very least in the American context, is to talk about the process in which a white identity was constructed out of these disparate groups. As with any academic field, you have like good and bad scholarship, and I think it's critically important when we talk about whiteness in the United States. We're talking about an identity which is geographically limited. There is a broader sort of white politics that takes place, but you're dealing with ethnic groups, and whiteness was a ideological methodology used to consolidate ethnic identities, because Anglo and Irish, who was, that the British brutalized the Irish people.
Well, what is fascinating from the historical perspective is the first time the concept of whiteness or white identity is dispatched in American colonial history is a direct consequence of a phenomenon known as Bacon's Rebellion. If you don't know the history of Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion in which white indentured servants and black, who were at that time would have been called as the enslaved or slaves, were going to unite to overthrow plantation economies in colonial America. And it was after that rebellion that the concept of a definitive whiteness was constructed in order to neutralize the capacity of these two factions coming together to work together to challenge the hierarchy of the plantation economy. So it's fascinating that how much the origins of these concepts are rooted in trying to dissuade the ability of two groups, both suffering from a form of economic exploitation, from coming together to challenge empire. And I got to tell you something, and I talk to Jason about this all the time. Some of the biggest enemies of cross-racial coalitions that you will find, from my experience, is not even so much white elites, it's black elites. I talk to Jason Jason, you saw the video I was talking about with my fraternity brothers, where I was talking about how black folk, poor white folk and poor black folk need to come together and work together and get you Negroes out of their business. These guys were losing their minds. And you know why? Because their status, position, and utility to the ruling class is based on being racial ventriloquists for people who are not even in their class position. So Joyanne Reid loves the fact that Gene has white liberal friends telling him that he should listen to her show to get the black experience from her African and Guyanese background in America, because it validates her $1 million annual salary in dollars to be able to tell her and her audience that black people don't like Bernie Sanders because he's racially tone deaf, but we love Obama and Hillary and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Come on, man.
Come on, man.
And this orchestration is real. Karen Hunter, who Jason was talking about, is literally, from good sources I know, a Republican. So this is a Republican black woman on her radio show telling black people why she doesn't like Bernie Sanders because he comes from a state in Vermont. Well, come on now. You can't get no collard greens in Vermont. You know, she's playing that bullshit racial authenticity card in order to deny working class black people things like a federal jobs guarantee. Now, logically, as good leftists as we are, if we agree that black people are disproportionately rendered to the reserve army of labor, is there anything better we could think of to help stop that than a federal jobs guarantee?
Universal basic income.
Universal basic income, you know, as long as it's not the
I'll take either.
Guy.
Yeah.
Or both.
Or better yet. But yeah.
And we know, you know, and I think, you know, there's some fetishization of MMT, but we do know that, you know, I think one of the key things that I get from MMT, which is modern monetary theory, is the idea that we can spend money so long as the productive capacity of the country can support that spending. You know, the notion that printing is money is limited by some kind of abstract, value, inherent value of the money is nonsense. What matters is, does your country have the productive capacity to take up that spending?
Exactly.
And you know, like, yes, and so for the United States in particular, there is an enormous capacity to spend money to ameliorate the lives. And you know, Kelton's book, which I recently finished, made the point. It's like, we don't give a damn in America about how much money we will dump into blundering military adventures.
The F-35, which doesn't even work.
The F-35,
MMT,
and then
MMT is already happening.
I mean, it's already happening when it comes to bombing Afghanistan. You look at this; they put trillions into Afghanistan. They're leaving, and the Taliban's coming back right now. Like this morning, you know, the Taliban is seizing more and more territory. So we literally, even from the own national security perspective, they're like, you could spend that money on building the infrastructure of the country. You know, like I was talking to a friend of mine who's considering a run in Missouri for the Senate against Josh Hawley, and he was like, look, you know, one of my ideas for a campaign would be, you know, Josh Hawley talks about how scary China is, but why don't we just go to China, and I'll interview Chinese people who have been to America to like ask them what they think about the American infrastructure and whether they think America is really, because America is going to rack and ruin at home. And
there's no shortage of productivity enhancing projects that you could do, which would have a net positive contribution to growth. We're not even talking about necessarily putting everything into consumption. The United States is overdue for
massive infrastructure.
And massive investments in public services.
Green technology and green jobs in looking after old people. Unless we want to exterminate old people, what are we going to do with all the boomers, right? You know, this is the key question. And you know, the United States, the problem in the United States, and we've talked about this before, is that it's a country in a malaise without a purpose. You have one wing of the ruling class, which is the liberal wing is more delusional than the conservative wing in terms of like
it's always 1996 for them.
It was 1996, you know, and the conservative wing is scarily brutal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they will attempt to use racial solidarity as a methodology in order to ensure at least some kind of social base for the country by distributing patronage to certain elements of the population to keep them on board.
The bottom line is that the American political imagination is limited by this unwillingness to escape capitalist realism as a construct. In other words, the notion of developing even social democracy is so anathema to the financial elites in this country that it will not allow, even though they know it would be a better thing, that they're just terrified because they don't want their profit margins to be affected by higher taxes or a variety of things. But
and it would
ultimately give up power. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
MMT also MMT won't work in that way because MMT would technically, if we use it for all these programs, like take away the power of those elites.
It allows the state to do economic planning rather than privatizing economic planning to the financial peak and private sector.
It allows members of this, like the educated elite, the top people are not herded into sectors like national intelligence or industry, but can actually, pursue the idealism that many of them have when they undertake the degrees in law and things, because they're not coming out in huge student debt. They're not dependent on their job for their insurance. It gives the American worker an enormous amount of freedom, and so there's many benefits of it. But of course, yes, this would lead to the crippling or at least severe limitation of the power of the American ruling class, which of course they don't want.
Yeah, forget the Earth. They want to expand their empire to Mars. They're not going to give up anything.
And it doesn't even have to be necessarily rational in the sense that it's connected to a bottom line. Like it's just the power that they don't want to give up. I think at a certain point. That's what matters.
And actually, one of the insidious things in that can happen under capitalism, even in social democracies, is that the upper middle class, sort of PMC layer, their opposition to certain forms of redistribution or certain kinds of class-based politics has to do with the fact that they want their class position based on education, merit, and achievement. They want that respected. They want their tradesmen to make less money than them. They want people to call them sir and doctor. And even if they have a personal ethic that's egalitarian, right, they don't want that institutionalized in a way that deprives them of agency, because it's always better to have agency and it's always better to have power than to be on the other side of it. And it's very difficult to convince somebody to give up something that they, especially if they think they've earned it, that allows them to flex more than anybody else.
So guys, we've reached the 2-hour mark like 5 minutes ago, and I think at least we need a break. And I was wondering before I asked you if you had some time for an after show. Now it's already 2 hours in. How is your time looking? Do you still have some time, or do you have to be off?
I have a little bit of time.
Yeah, we could stick around for a little bit for the after show.
20 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that. Pascal?
I could do like 20 minutes.
Works for me. I'm enjoying the conversation so far.
Yeah.
It's absolutely brilliant. I'm really in awe. I mean, you four guys, you just like go on. It's like, okay, you don't even need a facilitator. You just and you're even advancing in the topics, like through our list of interview questions. You're like, okay. On your own. It's breathtaking. It is actually breathtaking because it's so solid. It's not just talking. It's solid information. So. Chapeau. Fuck
yeah. I mean, after that, how can any of us say no to like the after show, right? Well played, sir.
I like German comrades already, man.
That's how it goes. Guys, let's take 5 minutes of a break.
Yeah, 5 minutes. And then
let's take a 5 minutes break. I'll send you another link and we'll meet in another room for that, all right?
Okay.
Excellent.
No problem.
Okay, alle anderen, die gerade im Chat waren, die Hauptfolge ist jetzt vorbei. Wir werden jetzt im Patreon, in der Patreon Aftershow in der Nachspielzeit noch ein bisschen weiter quatschen. Aber so den wichtigsten Kram habt ihr jetzt mitbekommen. Insofern.
Na, wobei, jetzt kommt der richtig wichtige Kram, aber den kriegt ihr nur, wenn ihr Patreon werdet.
Genau, der richtig wichtige Kram, den kriegt ihr dann, wenn ihr Patreon werdet. Genau. Okay, Leute, Jason, I took your line. Wir sind out.